Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to present. Hopefully you can see my slides. I think I'm going to preface my talk with a few comments. One is that I think we can safely describe COVID-19 as the ultimate disruptor. And in the risk management context, I don't think anyone really saw it coming. We've seen clips of Bill Gates, who had a vision of this in 2015, but as risk managers, I think it took us all on the blind side. And so the question is, do we need a complete rethink about risk management and our business continuity management after COVID-19? So I start off by saying, are our assumptions correct? So, what is it that we've been assuming about the world when we assess our risk? And are all of those assumptions still valid? And I'm afraid part of my talk will present a lot of questions and not necessarily a lot of answers, but I think that the questions pave the way to where we must go as risk managers. So, is it correct to assume that the way things have been before is the way that they will always be in the future? And quite clearly, that's not the case. In my lifetime, we've never had a pandemic before. And so, that would have been pretty low on anyone's risk register, because we would all have had our probabilities at sort of, very low to almost none. And yet this came to pass. And so as we assess risks, I ask the question, do we need to start with a whole lot of different scenarios? Looking, for instance, at things like Clem Sunter's high and low road scenarios in various cases. And I think the answer to that has to be yes, we've got to do proper scenario planning before we do our risk assessment. And then the question I ask is whether we need to build factors into our risk assessments which build in different scenarios and assumptions. So to an extent, that's already done in this space, but not on a sort of systemic basis. So let's just talk about outliers, because I think that COVID-19 is what one would describe as an outlying risk. And so, again, the question I ask is, what is an outlier? So is it something that we would look at as global? Is it a pandemic? Is it a war? Is it, the rising of the oceans, global warming? Or is it simply a risk that has potentially catastrophic outcomes, no matter how remote that risk may be? So I think as risk managers, we need to decide what are the outliers that we've been ignoring for a long time, and how do we bring them into the mix? So again, I ask the question without necessarily knowing the answer, but do they need to be assessed and rated on a basis other than the traditional impact times probability? So, are there perhaps new factors that need to be brought in? And where we have outliers, have we properly mitigated them, knowing what we now know? So I turn then to the assessment of our high impact and low probability risks, which is very much where this would have sat on most people's registers. So I want to suggest that all registers should probably be reassessed, and a higher emphasis placed on the impact column. In a way, that's kind of an exponential thing. And so, for instance, where your impacts are described as catastrophic, do we put mitigation measures in place anyway? And if we do we have a business case for doing that? Because mitigation measures very often cost a lot of money. Not always, but they do. And and then do we need to review the registers generally and have a rethink about how we assess things like likelihood and probability. So, you know, one great example for those of you who are cricket fans is commentators will often say, well, the score looks okay now, but what would happen if you added 2 wickets to it? And suddenly the score looks completely different. And so maybe that's what we need to do when we're doing our assessments of these outliers or the catastrophic impact risks, and say, well, our probability is very low, but what happens if we add 2 notches to it and play it on that basis? And it turns then to our BCM scenarios. And I ask the question whether those outliers like COVID-19 are simply a disaster which have to be managed through BCM, or is it a sui generis risk which has to be looked at in isolation? So is it safe to fall back on the BCM plan when the outlier arrives? And if so, are the current assumptions of our BCM plans correct? So Wayne spoke about dusting off our BCM plans. I couldn't agree more. I think that knowing what we do know now, we do need to review those and review them very carefully, because a whole new set of facts has come in, and we're being sorely tested. But there's no doubt that where we have these outliers, we do have to fall back on those BCM plans. So at the very heart of our risk management mitigation, we need to create the resilience through our business continuity, and as a worst case say, well, that's what we fall back on. Because this has illustrated more than ever that those people who had those plans well in place are probably the guys who are going to come out of it best and quickest. So I think there are 3 phases where we are and where we're going, and they've been covered to a large extent by Graham and Dana. But we're in business abnormal at the moment, working or not working in very unusual circumstances. So where we are in business still as an essential service or a supplier of essential goods, or in maintenance, where we're allowed to be working, those people have experienced an upside risk, if we can call it that. So manufacturers of sanitizers could never in their wildest dreams have imagined the demand that there was suddenly going to be on sanitizers. And so were we ready for that? Are we ready, where we recognize upside risks in our businesses, to address those, capitalize on them? And if not, why not? So, you know, is there a business case for a hand sanitizing company to make, you know, zillions of liters of the stuff if there's no pandemic? Or, you know, is there simply a way that you can be prepared to gear up and get ready for those upside risks when they come? And, you know, what are the constraints? So as risk managers, we need to look at those constraints for when that upside risk arises. For those of us who are in business, and I put myself in that category just, you know, but working remotely. So I mean, it's some of the work I do is essential, but some of the work my firm does is non essential. But where we are in business and able to work remotely, what are our constraints? And if we accept that this is not over and won't be over for a long time, and other risks may come along just like it, you know, what do we need to look at outside of the business and inside the business? Now, I ask, for instance, counterparties. It's all very well saying I'm in business, but if my counterparties are not, you know, how do I manage that? Do I look for new counterparties? How do I make myself resilient? And cash flow, of course, is a big question at this time. And for those who are out of business, how should we be planning for the post-COVID era? And what can we do now in that planning? How should we be looking after our resources, after our people? And what will restructuring and rebuilding look like? Should we be retooling altogether? And we then go into the phases of near normal and new normal, and a lot of those have been discussed this morning, and I'm not going to talk about those any further. Just looking at some of the businesses which are at risk, with both upside and downside risks in a post-COVID era. I name them without going into details, but some of them will be obvious. But the banking and finance sector, I think, is going to be hugely stretched in trying to help out businesses that have got into trouble, but not put their own businesses at risk. Conference organizers, I think, are going to rethink their models significantly. We've been involved in any number of webinars which work very well, and I think that this has been a huge disruption for that genre of business. Your data, communications, IT service providers, all were in that upside risk. God, sorry. I don't know how I get rid of this thing. We're all in that upside risk, and may not have been ready for it, and I think have been stretched. Even people, like Zoom, for instance, have had their issues. People in property, there was a discussion, Graham raised it, about, do we need as much space as we used to need? Is office space going to be the thing that it's always been? And I think people in property are going to have to rethink how they do business and what their business models are. Transport and logistics, massive. Dana spoke about the ports, and absolutely spot on. At the moment, Durban has somewhere north of 36 ships sitting outside waiting to come in. And Transnet is going to take a long time to get themselves back on track. I think the transport and logistics are going to be absolutely key to the recovery of this economy afterwards. And, where do people sit in that? Are they at risk of that? There's going to be such a premium on those things as business gets going again. And, how do we plan for shortages in those areas? Travel and hospitality, big issues for obvious reasons. But one of the things that occurs to me, both in the transport and those industries, is should they be retooling completely? I think I heard something about SAA converting passenger planes to cargo planes. Perhaps the same is going to happen in the cruise ship industry. So there may be some significant retooling required after this, and that would be all part of that scenario planning. And for those who have got into trouble, who've emptied the war chest, paying salaries despite not having any work, how are we going to reinvest, restructure, pay for raw materials, and carry whip until people can start paying again? So there are lots of other businesses at risk, and I'd invite you to consider whether yours is one of them. I've got a shopping list of specific risks and mitigation measures, and I suspect I'm pretty much out of time. This will be available, but some of the real obvious ones are liquidity. This is going to go on for a while, and how do we manage the liquidity issues with which most businesses, other than the essential ones, are clearly going to be faced, and not just for this, but for the new normal risks, the new outliers which will come through the door. In South Africa, we're particularly faced with soft currencies, high interest rates. Something that we've noticed on or given a lot of advice on the legal side is force majeure events. So all of this falls arguably within the contractual space of force majeure, although in many instances, particularly the triple P concessions, force majeure doesn't cover something like this. And so the invitation on the risk side is to start reviewing contracts looking at back-to-back contracts with counterparties and saying, does this all align? Does this all make sense? Because otherwise you can find yourself at the wrong end of a force majeure declaration and unable to pass that on down the line. So, you know, all sorts of other things to think about, access to materials in a world of shortage hereafter, and that shortage will persist until people like China and so on come back on stream. I think there's a lot to look at in the specific risks and mitigation measures to consider. And one of the things I would want to propose, Chris, is through this forum is to have different workshops to review some of that stuff and some of the way we rethink risk assessment. As I say, I don't pretend to have the answers. I have some thoughts, but I think we need a wider forum to discuss this. So that pretty much comes to an end on my side. Some thoughts, my thoughts, and I hope they were of some use to you. Thank you.